There are moments in history when a single invention reshapes the destiny of nations. The cotton gin was such a moment. In 10 months of obsessive work, a young Yale graduate would solve a problem that had confounded Southern agriculture for generations. But solving the problem was only the beginning. What followed was a 13-year war against pirates who stole his design, a legal crusade across 8 states, and a fortune lost even as his invention generated hundreds of millions for others. This is the story of Eli Whitney, a man whose genius transformed America, whose perseverance established patent law, and whose manufacturing principles would spark the Industrial Revolution itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Massachusetts in 1765 was a landscape of stone walls and rigid expectations. The colony's farms demanded constant labor, its industries centered on fishing and shipping, and its families valued practical skill above abstract thinking. Into this world, on the 8th of December, Eli Whitney arrived at his father's farm in Westborough. Nothing in his surroundings suggested he would one day alter the course of American history. His father owned a modest farm and operated a small workshop. There were no books of science in the house, no tutors to guide young minds toward invention. Eli should have grown up to inherit the farm, to work the same rocky soil his father worked, to fade into the countless generations who lived and died without leaving their mark. But something in the boy's nature refused that fate. Watch him at age 12, working in his father's workshop. Other children are doing farm chores, learning to plant and harvest. Eli is dismantling a watch his father gave him, laying out each tiny gear and spring on the workbench, studying how these miniature pieces work, together to mark the passage of time. His father finds him there hours later, the watch in dozens of pieces. But Eli isn't worried. He knows he can rebuild it, and he does. The Revolutionary War arrives when Eli is 11 years old. British trade restrictions make imported goods scarce and expensive. Most families simply do without. Eli sees opportunity. He notices that nails, once cheap and plentiful from British suppliers, have become precious. A single nail might cost what an hour's labor would earn. So he teaches himself blacksmithing. He's 13 years old, hammering iron in his father's forge, producing nails to sell to neighbors. The business thrives. Local builders begin requesting his nails specifically, praising their consistency and quality. When the war ends and British nails flood the market again, Eli's nail business collapses overnight. Another person might have despaired. Eli simply shifted focus. He observed women struggling with the pins and clasps that fastened their clothing, saw how these small items broke easily and cost dearly. Within weeks, he had taught himself the delicate metalwork required to produce hat pins and walking stick decorations. Again, his products gained a reputation for quality. Again, orders arrived faster than he could fill them. There is something remarkable happening here, something that transcends simple mechanical skill. Eli Whitney possesses a particular form of genius, the ability to observe a problem, strip it down to its essential elements, and devise a practical solution. He doesn't theorize or philosophize. He builds, he tests, he refines. This practical genius, combined with absolute determination, will change everything. But first, he must escape the farm. Education was not automatic in colonial Massachusetts. It cost money his family barely had, and it required years away from farm labor his father desperately needed. By the time Eli was 19, most young men his age were already married, already settled into their life's work. Eli was still dreaming of college, still saving every penny from his metalwork business, still defying his father's expectations. He knew he lacked the classical education Yale required: Latin, Greek, advanced mathematics. These were languages of privilege, taught to wealthy boys by private tutors. So Eli taught himself. He borrowed books from the local minister, studying by candlelight after 14-hour days in the workshop. When he discovered gaps in his knowledge, he found teachers willing to tutor him in exchange for his metalwork. It took him 4 years of this grueling self-education before he felt ready to apply. He was 23 years old when he finally entered Yale College in 1789. Most freshmen were 17 or 18, sons of merchants and professionals who had attended prestigious preparatory academies. They wore fine clothes and spoke casually about their travels to Boston or New York. Eli arrived in homespun clothing, with calluses on his hands and gaps in his classical education that made some professors doubt he belonged there at all. But Yale transformed him, not because it taught him new skills he could outwork any student in the practical sciences, but because it exposed him to ambitious men who believed they could shape the new nation's future. The United States was barely a decade old. Everything felt possible. Professors spoke of scientific advancement as a patriotic duty, of invention as the path to national greatness. Students debated economic theory and agricultural reform late into the night. Eli absorbed it all with the intensity he had once brought to dismantling watches. He impressed his mathematics professor with an intricate surveying instrument he built from scratch. He solved a mechanical problem that had stumped the college's natural philosophy department, designing a more efficient water pump for the dormitory. Word spread that the oldest student from the Massachusetts farm possessed unusual talents. But talent doesn't pay debts, and Eli graduated in 1792, owing money he couldn't repay and facing a future with no clear direction. The position that seemed his salvation arrived through a Yale connection, a tutoring job with a wealthy family in South Carolina. The salary would clear his debts and give him time to decide his next move. So, in September 1792, Eli boarded a coastal sailing vessel bound south, carrying all his possessions in a single trunk and having no idea that this journey would lead him not to South Carolina, but to Georgia, not to tutoring, but to invention, not to comfort, but to a battle that would consume the next 13 years of his life. The voyage itself reshaped his plans. Eli met Phineas Miller aboard ship, a young man who managed a plantation called Mulberry Grove near Savannah, Georgia. Miller was traveling with the plantation's owner, Catherine Greene, widow of the Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene. Catherine was returning from a stay in Rhode Island, bringing her children back to their southern home. She was intelligent, charming, and possessed the confidence of someone who had navigated society at the highest levels during the Revolution. Conversations during the 2-week voyage revealed that Eli's promised tutoring position had been misrepresented. The salary was half what he had been promised. Catherine Greene, observing his distress, made an impulsive offer: stay at Mulberry Grove as her guest while sorting out his future. The invitation was casual, the kind of hospitality wealthy Southerners extended routinely. Eli accepted gratefully, expecting to stay a few weeks at most. He could not have known that Mulberry Grove would become his laboratory, that Catherine Greene would become his patron and protector, that the cotton growing in the plantation's fields would become his obsession. Mulberry Grove stood on a bluff overlooking the Savannah River, a grand plantation house surrounded by outbuildings, workshops, and fields stretching toward distant pine forests. The property covered several thousand acres, worked by dozens of enslaved people who planted, tended, and harvested the crops that generated the Greene family's income. It was rice. Mostly rice thrived in the low-country wetlands and commanded good prices in European markets. But rice required enormous investments in dikes and flooding systems and levees. Catherine Greene was looking for alternatives, for crops that might prove more profitable with less infrastructure. Many planters were experimenting with cotton. Short staple cotton grew readily in Georgia's upland soil, far from the coastal wetlands, but there was a problem. Cotton bolls contained seeds deeply embedded in the fiber. Long staple cotton, grown on the sea islands, had seeds that pulled free relatively easily. A skilled worker could clean 7 or 8 pounds in a day, making it profitable for export. Short staple cotton had seeds that clung stubbornly to every fibre. The same worker might clean only 1 pound per day. At that rate, short staple cotton was worthless. The labour required to clean it exceeded the fibre's market value. Eli arrived at Mulberry Grove in October 1792, expecting to stay until he secured another tutoring position. He spent his first weeks exploring the plantation, conversing with Catherine and Phineas Miller, observing the rhythms of southern agriculture. He watched enslaved workers in the cotton fields, saw them separate seeds from fibre by hand in a process so tedious and slow it seemed almost medieval. He learned that cotton could clothe the world if only someone could solve this one bottleneck. Consider the moment when Catherine Green, perhaps casually, perhaps deliberately, posed the problem to her house guest. "Here is cotton that will grow anywhere," she might have said. "Here is a fibre the world desperately needs. But here, too, is a problem no one has solved. Can you devise a machine to clean it?" Eli Whitney had spent his entire life solving problems other people thought unsolvable. He had taught himself blacksmithing at 13, college-level mathematics at 21, mechanical principles that confounded Yale professors. He looked at the cotton and saw not an agricultural problem, but a mechanical one. Seeds cling to fibre. Force must separate them. The force must be strong enough to tear the seeds free, but gentle enough to preserve the fibre. It was simply a matter of finding the right mechanism. He asked for a workspace. Catherine offered him a small outbuilding, a workshop where he could experiment undisturbed. He gathered tools, scrap metal, wooden boards. He asked the plantation overseer to bring him cotton bolls in various stages of ripeness, seeds still embedded in fibre. Then he closed the workshop door and began. It was November 1792. Winter was arriving, such as winter comes to coastal Georgia. Outside the workshop, plantation life continued its ancient rhythms. Inside, a young man from Massachusetts was about to trigger a revolution that would reshape America, enrich the few, enslave millions more, and prove impossible to stop. The workshop at Mulberry Grove measured perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet. It had been used for plantation repairs, for mending tools and fashioning simple implements. Now it became the birthplace of a revolution. Eli Whitney locked himself inside with cotton bolls, wire, wood, and an obsession that would consume the next 10 months of his life. Imagine standing outside that workshop in November 1792. You might hear hammering, the rasp of a file against metal, occasional muttered calculations. Sometimes hours would pass in silence. Then sudden activity, wood splitting, metal clanging, the creak of a hand-cranked mechanism being tested. Catherine Green and Phineas Miller learned not to interrupt. When Eli emerged, usually after dark, he was covered in cotton lint, his fingers bleeding from wire cuts, his eyes burning with sleepless intensity. He started with the obvious approach. Cotton gins already existed for long staple cotton simple roller mechanisms that squeeze seeds out while letting fibre pass through. Eli built several variations, adjusting the pressure, changing the roller spacing, experimenting with different materials. None worked. Short staple cotton seeds clung too tightly. The rollers either crushed the seeds into the fibre, creating an unusable mess, or failed to separate them at all. Weeks passed. Eli filled the workshop with failed prototypes. He tried brushes that might sweep seeds away. They tangled in the fibre. He tried combs that might pull fibre free. They broke the delicate strands. He tried every variation of pressure and motion his mechanical mind could devise. Nothing worked at the speed and efficiency required. December arrived. Eli had been at Mulberry Grove for 2 months, living on Catherine Green's hospitality while producing nothing but broken mechanisms and mounting frustration. A lesser person might have admitted defeat, might have concluded that some problems simply have no solution. Eli Whitney was not a lesser person. He went back to first principles. Stop thinking about existing cotton gins, he told himself. Stop trying to modify what others have built. Observe the problem fresh, as if seeing it for the first time. He sat in the workshop holding a cotton bowl, studying how seeds embedded themselves in fiber. The seeds were smooth, oval, about the size of a small bean. The fiber wrapped around them in layers, each strand clinging as if trying to protect what it surrounded. What if, instead of trying to pull fiber away from seeds, he pulled seeds away from fiber? The distinction seemed subtle, but it changed everything. Eli envisioned hooks, small, sharp hooks that could pierce through the fiber, grab the seeds, and yank them free. The fiber, being lighter and more flexible, would simply fall away or could be brushed off. The seeds, being heavier and firmly hooked, would be carried through the mechanism. He bent wire into tiny hooks and mounted them on a wooden cylinder. He arranged the hooks in rows, ensuring they protruded just far enough to catch seeds but not so far they would tangle. Then he built a frame to hold cotton bolls against the rotating cylinder. He added a hopper where uncleaned cotton would feed in, and a chamber where cleaned fiber would emerge. His hands shook as he turned the crank for the first time. The hooks rotated, caught the cotton, pulled it against a metal grating. Seeds should tear through the fiber and get pulled through the grating while fiber stayed behind. That was the theory. The hooks caught the fiber and ripped it apart. Eli adjusted the grating spacing. Too narrow and nothing passed through. Too wide and everything passed through, seeds and fiber together. He spent days finding the precise measurement openings large enough for seeds to pass but too small for clumped fiber to follow. He tried again. This time, seeds passed through, but they brought fiber with them, creating the same tangled mess he'd been fighting for months. The problem was the hooks themselves. They grabbed seeds but also grabbed fiber, pulling both through together. What if there were two mechanisms, one to pull seeds through, another to strip fiber away? Eli added brushes on the opposite side of the cylinder, rotating in the opposite direction. As hooks pulled seeds through the grating, brushes swept fiber away from the hooks, preventing it from following the seeds through. It was elegant in its simplicity, two opposing forces, one pulling seeds forward, one pushing fiber back. He tested this new design on a cold January morning in 1793. He had been working for 3 months straight, producing nothing marketable, living on borrowed, hospitality, growing more desperate with each failure. He fed cotton bolls into the hopper, turned the crank, and watched. The hooks caught seeds, the brushes swept fiber. Seeds pulled through the grating and dropped into a collection bin. Clean fiber, white as snow, accumulated on the brush side. It worked. Eli kept cranking, afraid to stop, afraid the mechanism would fail on the second rotation or the third. But it didn't fail. Seeds kept separating from fiber with beautiful mechanical efficiency. After 10 minutes of cranking, he had cleaned more cotton than a skilled worker could clean in a day. He ran to find Catherine Green and Phineas Miller. They came to the workshop and watched in silence as Eli demonstrated his machine. He fed in raw cotton bowls. Out came clean fiber on one side, seeds on the other. The process was messy. Cotton lint filled the air. Seeds occasionally jammed the mechanism. But it worked. By God, it actually worked. Catherine understood the implications immediately. One person cranking this machine could do the work of 50 people cleaning by hand. Scale it up, add water power or horsepower to turn the mechanism, and you could clean hundreds of pounds per day. Short staple cotton, worthless for centuries, suddenly became profitable. Georgia's upland soil, previously useful only for subsistence farming, could now grow a cash crop rivaling any in the world. But the machine was crude. The hooks broke frequently. The brushes wore out. cotton jammed in the grating. Fiber quality varied depending on crank speed. Eli had proven the concept, but turning that concept into a reliable, manufacturable product would require months more work. He returned to the workshop with renewed purpose. Now he knew the mechanism worked. The question became how to perfect it. He experimented with wire gauge, testing which thickness produced hooks strong enough to last but fine enough not to damage fiber. He tried different brush materials, seeking the bristles that could sweep cotton effectively without wearing down or breaking. He adjusted the grating spacing for different cotton varieties, discovering that each type required slightly different measurements. February passed, then March. Eli was refining constantly, testing each modification against a simple metric. How much cotton could the machine clean in one day? His first working prototype managed about 10 pounds. Not impressive, but proof the concept had merit. He improved the hook design, achieving 20 pounds daily. He optimized the brush rotation, reaching 30 pounds. He adjusted the grating and hopper, hitting 40 pounds. By April 1793, his cotton gin could clean 50 pounds per day, 50 times what a skilled worker could accomplish by hand. The machine fit on a single table. One person could operate it. The materials cost perhaps $10, and it solved a problem that had made short staple cotton economically worthless. Eli understood he had created something extraordinary, but he also understood, with growing anxiety, that this machine was almost too simple. Anyone who saw it could copy it. The mechanical principles were obvious once demonstrated: hooks pull seeds, brushes sweep fiber, grating separates the two. A competent craftsman could build a replica in a week. Without legal protection, without a patent securing his rights, this invention would be stolen before he could profit from it. He needed to get to Philadelphia, to the patent office, to secure his intellectual property before anyone else saw what he had built. But he also needed funding to manufacture gins, to establish a business, to turn this invention into a fortune. Catherine Green and Phineas Miller offered to become partners, providing capital in exchange for shares of the profits. The three of them formed an informal company with a simple plan. Whitney would secure the patent, manufacture the gins in secret, and lease them to planters rather than selling outright. This way they would maintain control of the technology and collect ongoing fees based on cotton production. It was a sound business plan built on a fatal miscalculation. They assumed planters would respect patent rights, would pay licensing fees, would wait for Whitney to manufacture enough gins to meet demand. They assumed the legal system would protect innovators from pirates. They assumed Southern courts would enforce Northern patents. Every assumption was wrong. In May 1793, Eli departed for Philadelphia, carrying detailed drawings of his cotton gin and letters of introduction from Catherine Green. The journey took 2 weeks by coach and ship. Philadelphia was the nation's temporary capital, a city of 30,000 people where the federal government conducted its business. The patent office occupied a small building near Independence Hall, staffed by clerks who processed applications with bureaucratic slowness. Eli submitted his patent application in June. The process required detailed drawings, written descriptions of the mechanism, and sworn statements about the invention's originality. He spent weeks satisfying the clerk's demands, redrawing specifications, and clarifying explanations. Finally, in March 1794, the patent was granted. United States Patent Number 72X, New and Useful Improvement in the Mode of Ginning Cotton. The document gave Eli Whitney exclusive rights to manufacture, use, and sell cotton gins for 14 years. He believed the patent would protect him. He had no idea it would become the most violated patent in American history. While Eli was in Philadelphia securing legal protection, back in Georgia the secret was leaking out. Catherine Green had shown the prototype to a few trusted neighbors, hoping to generate interest for when gins became available. Those neighbours had told other neighbours. Word spread through the planter community with extraordinary speed. The young man at Mulberry Grove had built a machine that could clean 50 pounds of cotton daily. Planters arrived at Mulberry Grove asking to see the gin. Catherine, proud of her investment, sometimes allowed demonstrations. She believed the patent would prevent copying, believed Southern gentlemen would respect intellectual property rights. She didn't understand the economics that were already dooming Whitney's enterprise. Consider the mathematics from a planter's perspective. Building a cotton gin cost about $300 in materials and labour, a substantial investment, but manageable for anyone with a working plantation. That gin could clean 50 pounds of cotton per day. Multiply that by 300 working days per year, and one gin cleaned 15,000 pounds annually. At market prices of 20 cents per pound for cleaned cotton, that gin enabled $3,000 in revenue each year. Subtract costs for labour and cultivation, and a planter might net $2,000 annually from cotton that would have been worthless without the gin. A $300 investment generating $2,000 annual profit represents a return of more than 600% in the first year alone. No legitimate business opportunity in America offered anything comparable. The temptation to build an illegal gin was overwhelming, the potential profit enormous, the risk minimal. Most planters owed allegiance to their local community, not to some Massachusetts inventor they'd never met. Many genuinely believed that an idea so simple couldn't be owned, that Whitney's patent was governmental overreach, that building their own gin was simply good business. By the time Eli returned to Georgia with his patent in hand, 60 illegal gins were already operating across the state. 60. He hadn't manufactured a single commercial model. He hadn't collected a penny in licensing fees. And 60 planters were already generating fortunes from his invention. The betrayal was staggering. Eli had spent 10 months in obsessive experimentation, had solved a problem that had stumped Southern agriculture for generations, had followed the legal process precisely as required. Now he discovered that following the rules had only delayed him while pirates stole his future. Catherine Green and Phineas Miller tried to maintain optimism. The patent was clear, they insisted. The law was on their side. They would take the pirates to court, would win judgments, would collect damages that would compensate for the theft. Eli wanted to believe them, but walking through Georgia's countryside, seeing illegal gins operating openly on plantation after plantation, he felt the first cold grip of fear that the law might prove worthless against an entire region's economic interests. He had created a machine that worked perfectly. Now he faced a different challenge, one that required not mechanical genius but political will and legal expertise and financial resources he didn't possess. The battle for his invention had only begun, and already he was losing. The piracy began with a nighttime visit to Mulberry Grove in the spring of 1794. Someone broke into Whitney's workshop, examined his prototype gin, and made detailed sketches by lantern light. The intruder was never caught, but within weeks, near-perfect copies of Whitney's machine appeared on plantations across Georgia and South Carolina. These weren't rough approximations or crude imitations. They were sophisticated replicas that incorporated Whitney's exact hook spacing, his precise grating measurements, his brush design. Someone had studied his machine carefully, had understood the subtle engineering that made it work, and had shared that knowledge with plantation blacksmiths throughout the South. Eli stood in a South Carolina workshop that September, staring at a pirated gin that looked almost identical to his own design. The planter, a man named Edward Lyon, showed no shame. He insisted he'd built it independently, claimed the mechanism was obvious to anyone with mechanical aptitude. When Eli pointed out details that matched his patent drawings, exactly the specific angle of the wire hooks, the particular spacing of the grating slots, Leon simply shrugged. "Prove it in court," he said. "Prove it if you can. This would become the pattern. Planters would build illegal gins, would operate them openly, and would dare Whitney to sue. They understood something he was only beginning to grasp. The legal system moves slowly, courts favor local interests, and a prolonged legal battle costs money few inventors possess. They were betting that Whitney would exhaust his resources before achieving justice. They were almost right. By autumn 1794, the count had risen from 60 to more than 100 illegal gins operating in Georgia alone. South Carolina had 50 more. North Carolina, another 30. The machines were spreading faster than rumor, faster than disease, transforming southern agriculture with breathtaking speed. Planters who had grown tobacco or rice or corn were suddenly planting cotton, buying enslaved workers to cultivate and harvest it, building illegal gins to process it. The economics were simply too compelling to resist. Consider what was happening across the South in those months. A planter who might have cleared $500 in annual profit from traditional crops could now clear $5,000 from cotton. That's not a modest increase, it's a complete transformation of wealth. Planters were purchasing additional land, buying more enslaved people, constructing gins as fast as blacksmiths could build them. Everyone was making money except the man who had made it all possible. Whitney and Miller established a manufacturing facility in New Haven, Connecticut, hoping to flood the market with legitimate gins that would undercut the pirates. But manufacturing takes time, requires skilled labor, demands quality control. By the time they produced their first commercial gin in late 1794, 300 illegal copies were already operating across the South. By the time they produced their 100th gin, the pirates had built 1,000. The mathematics of this disaster are worth examining. Each illegal gin generated roughly $2,000 in annual profit for its owner. 300 illegal gins meant $600,000 in stolen profits in the first year alone. That's money that should have flowed to Whitney through licensing fees, money that would have made him wealthy beyond measure. Instead, it enriched the very people who had robbed him. Eli and Phineas decided they had no choice but to fight in court. In January 1795, they filed their first lawsuit against Edward Lyon in South Carolina. The trial would become a template for dozens more, a frustrating, expensive pattern that would repeat itself across 8 states over the next 13 years. The courtroom in Charleston was packed with planters who had come to support Lyon, to demonstrate solidarity against the northern inventor trying to collect fees they considered extortionate. Whitney's lawyer presented the patent, showed drawings of the original gin, demonstrated how Lyon's machine matched Whitney's design in every essential detail. It seemed an open and shut case of patent infringement. Lyon's defense was brilliantly simple. The cotton gin was not truly original. Similar devices had existed for centuries, he claimed. Whitney had merely modified an ancient principle, had taken what was common knowledge and tried to claim ownership. He produced witnesses who testified they'd seen roller gins in India, had heard of toothed mechanisms in Mexico, had themselves experimented with cotton cleaning devices. The testimony was mostly fabricated, but it created doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They returned a verdict in Lyon's favor. The patent was valid, they acknowledged, but Lyon's gin was sufficiently different in details of construction to avoid infringement. It was legal nonsense. Lyon's gin was nearly identical to Whitney's, but the jury consisted of plantation owners and merchants whose profits depended on ignoring patent rights. They would not rule against their own economic interests. Whitney was devastated. He had followed every legal requirement, had secured a valid patent, had demonstrated clear infringement, and still lost. The message to other pirates was unmistakable. Build your gin, make your fortune, and trust that southern courts will protect you from northern inventors. The losses mounted with horrifying speed. Whitney and Miller filed suit in Georgia, where friendly witnesses testified they'd seen pirates copying Whitney's machine directly. They lost. They sued in North Carolina, presenting irrefutable evidence of patent violation. They lost. They filed cases in Virginia, in Tennessee, in Mississippi. They lost. The legal expenses were crushing. Each case required travel to distant courthouses, required hiring local attorneys who understood state procedures, required weeks away from the manufacturing business that was itself failing. Phineas Miller sold property to pay legal fees. Catherine Green mortgaged Mulberry Grove. Whitney exhausted his savings, borrowed from friends, and still couldn't keep pace with mounting costs. But the financial damage was only part of their suffering. The emotional toll of fighting alone against an entire region's hostility was breaking both men. They received threats, anonymous letters warning them to drop their lawsuits, describing in graphic detail what might happen if they persisted. Pirates sabotaged their manufacturing facility in New Haven, starting a fire that destroyed months of work. Witnesses who agreed to testify on Whitney's behalf received visits from angry planters and suddenly developed memory problems. There were small victories. In 1796, a Georgia court ruled in Whitney's favor against a particularly brazen pirate who had copied the gin and then boasted publicly about it. The court awarded damages of $800, a pittance compared to the profits stolen, but a validation of Whitney's rights. The pirate simply refused to pay. When marshals attempted to seize property in compensation, local communities hid the man's assets. The judgment proved worthless. The piracy was evolving, becoming more sophisticated. Early copies had been crude, built by local blacksmiths working from stolen sketches. By 1797, professional manufacturers were producing illegal gins in large quantities, selling them openly, advertising their superior quality and lower price compared to Whitney's legitimate models. These weren't isolated craftsmen evading the law, these were organized businesses built entirely on theft. One pirate named Hodge and Holmes was particularly audacious. He claimed to have invented his own cotton gin, one that used sawtooth discs instead of wire hooks. He filed his own patent application, hoping to legitimize his copying. The patent office, recognizing the mechanism as merely a variation of Whitney's design, rejected the application. Holmes built his gins anyway, selling them across the South at prices Whitney couldn't match. Whitney sued Holmes in federal court in Georgia in 1797. The trial became a spectacle. Whitney brought his original prototype, demonstrating how it worked, explaining the years of experimentation that had led to his design. Holmes brought his saw-toothed version, claiming it was fundamentally different despite performing the identical function through nearly identical principles. The judge, William Stevens, owned a plantation where illegal gins were operating. He should have recused himself from the case. He didn't. Instead, he listened patiently to both sides, nodded thoughtfully at the arguments, and then ruled that Holmes's saw-toothed gin was sufficiently different from Whitney's hooked version to avoid patent infringement. It was judicial corruption dressed as legal reasoning. Everyone in the courtroom understood what had happened. The judge had ruled in favor of his own financial interests and the interests of his community. But there was no recourse. State judges were appointed by state governments controlled by the plantation class. Every judge had friends or relatives who profited from pirated gins. Expecting fair trials in this environment was like expecting the ocean to stay calm in a hurricane. Whitney and Miller tried a different approach. Instead of suing individual pirates, they offered a compromise: pay a licensing fee going forward, and we'll forgive past infringement. The proposal was generous, perhaps too generous. Instead of demanding full restitution for years of theft, they asked only that planters begin paying modest fees for future use. The planters rejected it. Why pay anything, they reasoned, when courts wouldn't enforce the patent? Why legitimize Whitney's claims when ignoring them cost nothing? A few planters, troubled by the theft, agreed to pay licensing fees, but they were ostracized by their communities, threatened with social and economic isolation. Most quickly stopped paying, preferring to remain in good standing with their neighbors. By 1800, the situation had become surreal. Thousands of cotton gins operated across the South by some estimates. More than 5,000 machines, perhaps 50, were legitimate gins manufactured by Whitney and Miller. The rest were pirated copies generating tens of millions of dollars in cotton revenue. Whitney's company was on the verge of bankruptcy despite having invented the technology that had made everyone else rich. The emotional impact on Whitney during these years is difficult to comprehend. Imagine creating something revolutionary, something that transforms an entire economy, and watching others steal it while courts shrug and communities celebrate the theft. He grew bitter, withdrawn, prone to dark moods, where he questioned why he'd ever shown his invention to anyone. Catherine Green worried about his health, his mental state, his growing conviction that the legal system was a cruel joke. Phineas Miller's health was failing more literally. The stress of constant legal battles, the financial losses, the endless travel to hostile courtrooms, all of it was killing him. He developed fevers, suffered from exhaustion, could barely sleep. Whitney begged him to rest, to let the legal fight go, to accept that they had lost. Miller refused. He had invested everything in this partnership, had believed in Whitney's genius, had mortgaged his future on the promise of legitimate profit. He would not surrender. In December 1800, Miller traveled to Tennessee for yet another patent trial. The journey was difficult, winter weather making the roads nearly impassable. He arrived exhausted, presented their case in court, and lost again. On the return journey, his fevers worsened. By the time he reached Georgia, he was delirious. He died in January 1801, at the age of 36, destroyed by the fight for rights that courts refused to protect. His death devastated Whitney. Miller had been more than a business partner, he had been a believer, someone who shared the conviction that innovation should be protected, that inventors deserved to profit from their genius. Without Miller, the fight felt impossible, but Catherine Green urged him to continue. Phineas had died for this cause, she said. Abandoning it now would make his sacrifice meaningless. So Whitney persisted. He filed more lawsuits, suffered more losses, accumulated more debt. But something was changing in the legal landscape. Northern newspapers were covering the patent wars, portraying Whitney as a martyred inventor, crushed by Southern greed. Federal judges were beginning to take notice, beginning to question whether state courts were deliberately sabotaging patent law. And in Washington, legislators were debating whether the patent system itself needed reform to protect inventors from regional hostility. In 1801, Whitney filed a crucial case in Georgia federal court. The judge, William Johnson, was a recent appointee by President John Adams, a man with no personal stake in cotton profits and no loyalty to plantation interests. For the first time, Whitney faced a judge who might actually care about justice. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Whitney presented his by now familiar evidence: the original patent, the prototype gin, testimony from witnesses who had seen pirates copying his design. The defense presented their by now familiar arguments. The gin was obvious. Others had invented similar devices. Whitney's patent shouldn't grant monopoly rights over a simple principle. Judge Johnson listened carefully. Then he delivered a ruling that changed everything. The patent was valid, he declared. The principle was indeed simple, but simplicity doesn't invalidate a patent. Often the most valuable inventions are obvious only after someone demonstrates them. Whitney's gin represented genuine innovation, and his patent granted legitimate rights that courts must protect. More importantly, Johnson ruled that any cotton gin using wire hooks or saw teeth to pull seeds through a grating, while brushes swept fiber away, was infringing Whitney's patent, regardless of minor variations in design. It didn't matter whether hooks were made of wire or steel, whether brushes rotated clockwise or counterclockwise, whether the frame was wood or iron. The fundamental principle was Whitney's invention, and using that principle without licensing it was theft. The ruling represented total victory. Whitney wept in the courtroom, overcome by the vindication he had sought for 7 years. Catherine Green, attending the trial, embraced him while judge and jury watched. The crowd of planters who had come expecting another loss sat in stunned silence. But the pirates weren't finished. They appealed to the Supreme Court, hoping to overturn Johnson's ruling. The appeal would take years to resolve, years during which illegal gins would continue operating and generating fortunes. And even if the Supreme Court upheld Whitney's patent, collecting damages from thousands of individual pirates across 8 states seemed nearly impossible. Whitney understood that legal victories, however satisfying, wouldn't restore his fortune. The cotton gin business was lost, destroyed by years of piracy before courts could protect him. But perhaps, he thought, there might be other inventions, other opportunities to apply his mechanical genius in industries where patents actually meant something. He was about to discover an opportunity that would save him financially, revolutionize manufacturing globally, and prove far more valuable than the cotton gin itself. The federal government needed muskets, needed them desperately, and was willing to pay extraordinary sums to anyone who could deliver them in quantity. Whitney knew nothing about firearms manufacturing, had never built a gun in his life. He was about to invent the modern arms industry. The Supreme Court case arrived in 1807, 13 years after Whitney filed his first lawsuit. 13 years of courtroom battles, hostile witnesses, corrupt judges, and mounting debt. 13 years of watching pirates grow wealthy while he struggled to pay his attorneys. The highest court in the land would finally, definitively, rule on whether his patent had meaning or whether theft was simply the price of innovation in America. Chief Justice John Marshall heard the case in Washington. The courtroom was crowded with observers who understood this ruling would reach far beyond cotton gins, would establish precedent for all patent law, would determine whether inventors could safely share their innovations or should hide them in secrecy forever. Whitney's attorneys presented the by now familiar evidence with practiced precision: the original patent, the prototype gin, testimony from witnesses who had watched pirates copy every detail, documentation of hundreds of illegal gins operating openly across the South, and most importantly, Judge Johnson's 1801 ruling that had finally recognized the scope and validity of Whitney's rights. The defense attorneys argued that Whitney had delayed too long in manufacturing his gins, that he had forfeited his rights through inaction, that the South's entire economy now depended on cotton gins, and disrupting that economy would cause catastrophic harm. They portrayed Whitney as a greedy northerner, trying to extract tribute from honest Southern farmers who had built their prosperity through hard work and initiative. It was a masterful bit of misdirection, portraying theft as initiative, presenting pirates as victims, suggesting that economic dependence on stolen technology somehow legitimized the theft. But Chief Justice Marshall was not swayed by regional sympathy or economic arguments. The law was clear, he stated in his ruling. Patents grant exclusive rights to inventors. Those rights don't expire because others have profited from violating them. Economic inconvenience doesn't excuse theft. The Supreme Court upheld Whitney's patent in full. Every cotton gin using wire hooks or saw teeth to separate seeds from fiber was infringing his rights. Every planter operating such a gin owed licensing fees. Every manufacturer producing illegal gins owed damages. The decision was comprehensive, unequivocal, a complete validation of everything Whitney had fought for since 1794. He should have been ecstatic. Instead, sitting in that Washington courtroom listening to Marshall read the decision, Whitney felt only exhaustion and bitter recognition. The victory had come too late. His cotton gin patent would expire in 1807, the same year the Supreme Court validated it. 13 years of legal warfare had consumed the entire patent term. There would be no fortune from cotton, no compensation for the millions stolen, No licensing fees from the thousands of gins operating across 8 states. The mathematics of this tragedy deserve contemplation. Conservative estimates suggested 5,000 cotton gins were operating in the South by 1807. If Whitney had collected even modest licensing fees of $50 per gin annually, a fraction of what he was legally entitled to, he would have earned $250,000 per year for 13 years. That's more than $3 million in total, an unimaginable fortune in the early 1800s. Instead, he had spent those 13 years going deeper into debt, while fighting for rights courts finally acknowledged only after they had ceased to matter. But the Supreme Court victory did accomplish something crucial beyond Whitney's personal finances. It established that patents were federally protected property rights that state courts must honor. It confirmed that simple, elegant inventions deserved protection equally with complex ones. It ruled that economic dependence on stolen technology didn't legitimize the theft. These principles would shape American patent law for the next 2 centuries, would encourage countless future inventors to share their innovations without fear that regional hostility would destroy their rights. Whitney's cotton gin battles also revealed the limits of patent protection. Having legal rights means nothing if courts won't enforce them. Winning in court means nothing if the damage has already been done. Perfect patent protection, paired with slow justice, equals theft, followed by vindication, a bitter prize that enriches pirates while destroying inventors. The aftermath of the Supreme Court decision exposed another harsh reality. Whitney could theoretically sue thousands of planters for past damages, could pursue claims worth millions of dollars, but each lawsuit would require separate trials, separate attorneys, years more of courtroom warfare. Most pirates had already made their fortunes and could afford lengthy appeals. Many had gone bankrupt during cotton price fluctuations and had no assets to seize. The practical reality was that even complete legal victory couldn't undo 13 years of theft. Catherine Green, who had supported Whitney financially and emotionally through the entire ordeal, urged him to let it go. The cotton gin was lost, she said. The patent would expire within months. Chasing damages would consume whatever years remained to him, would trap him in courtrooms for the rest of his life, would prevent him from creating new inventions that might actually generate profit. She had already lost Phineas Miller to this fight. She refused to watch it destroy Whitney too. He agreed, though the decision felt like surrender. He would pursue a handful of the most egregious cases, would collect what damages he could from pirates too brazen to ignore, but he would not devote his remaining years to vengeance against an industry that had already stolen everything it could from him. The final accounting was devastating. Whitney and Miller had invested approximately $60,000 in the cotton gin venture. Manufacturing costs, legal fees, travel expenses, and Catherine Green's mortgage plantation. They had collected perhaps $90,000 in licensing fees and damages, mostly from the handful of honest planters who had paid voluntarily. A profit of $30,000 over 14 years, divided among 3 partners, barely covered their living expenses. Meanwhile, cotton production in the South had exploded. In 1793, before Whitney's gin, the United States had exported 138,000 pounds of cotton. By 1807, that figure had reached 178 million pounds. The cotton gin had enabled an economic revolution worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Whitney's share was essentially nothing. The human cost extended far beyond Whitney's finances. The cotton gin had made slavery enormously more profitable. Before the gin, slavery in the South was declining, becoming economically marginal as tobacco exhausted the soil and rice required specialized conditions. Many founders had believed slavery would gradually disappear as it became less profitable. Whitney's invention reversed that decline catastrophically. Cleaning cotton by hand was so labor-intensive that large-scale cultivation made no economic sense. The gin changed everything. Suddenly, cotton became the South's most profitable crop, and cotton cultivation was labor-intensive in ways that demanded enslaved workers. The enslaved population in cotton-growing states had been approximately 700,000 in 1790. By 1820 it had risen to 1.4 million. The gin had created insatiable demand for enslaved labor to plant, tend, and harvest the cotton that gins could now clean efficiently. Whitney knew this, understood that his invention had strengthened an institution he personally abhorred. He had not intended this consequence, had not foreseen how solving a technical problem in agriculture would create economic incentives that made slavery more entrenched than ever. But intentions don't matter when consequences are this catastrophic. The cotton gin didn't cause slavery, didn't create the plantation system, didn't invent racism, but it made all of those things more profitable, more widespread, more difficult to end. This was the darkest part of his legacy, the shadow that would follow his name through history. Eli Whitney, the man who had made slavery more profitable than ever before. Eli Whitney, whose mechanical genius had helped forge the chains that bound millions. He had wanted to help Southern agriculture, to create prosperity, to demonstrate that innovation could solve ancient problems. Instead, he had created an economic engine that would help drive the nation toward civil war. In later years, when people asked about the cotton gin, Whitney would grow quiet and withdrawn. He would acknowledge the invention, would describe its mechanical principles, but he refused to celebrate it. The gin had destroyed him financially, had cost Phineas Miller his life, had strengthened slavery beyond anything he had imagined possible. Some inventions, he came to believe, should never have been made. Some problems should have remained unsolved. But even as the cotton gin legacy darkened around him, Whitney was discovering that his greatest contribution to civilization had nothing to do with cotton. His manufacturing principles, developed out of desperation when cotton profits failed to materialize, were revolutionizing industry in ways he was only beginning to understand. The musket factory he had built, the precision tools he had invented, the interchangeable parts he had pioneered, these were changing manufacturing itself. The cotton gin was finished. His real work was only beginning. The letter arrived in the spring of 1798, while Whitney was drowning in cotton gin litigation and debt. It came from the War Department in Philadelphia, signed by Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. The federal government needed muskets urgently. Relations with France were deteriorating toward war. The standing army was expanding rapidly, and America's ability to produce firearms was woefully inadequate. Traditional gunsmiths worked as craftsmen, building each musket individually by hand. A skilled artisan might complete one musket per month, fitting each part through patient filing and adjustment until the mechanism functioned properly. At that rate, even with dozens of gunsmiths working, the nation could barely arm a few regiments annually. The government needed thousands of muskets, needed them within 2 years, and was willing to pay extraordinary prices to anyone who could deliver them. Whitney saw an opportunity born of desperation. The cotton gin had failed financially despite its revolutionary impact. Perhaps firearms could succeed where agriculture had failed. He knew nothing about manufacturing muskets, had never built a gun, had no experience in metalworking at the scale required. But he understood machinery, understood precision, understood how to break complex problems into simple mechanical solutions. He submitted a proposal so audacious it should have been rejected immediately. He would deliver 10,000 muskets in 28 months for $134,000. The price was competitive, but the quantity was staggering. 10,000 muskets in 28 months meant completing more than 10 muskets per day, every day, for more than 2 years. No manufacturer in America could achieve such output. Most government officials assumed Whitney was either delusional or fraudulent, but the nation was desperate. Secretary Pickering approved the contract, perhaps reasoning that even if Whitney delivered only a fraction of the promised quantity, It would be more than the government could acquire elsewhere. Whitney received an advance of $5,000 and a deadline: deliver the first 4,000 muskets by September 1800. He immediately faced a problem that seemed insurmountable. Traditional gunsmithing required years of apprenticeship, demanded artistic skill in metalworking, relied on individual craftsmen adjusting each part until it fit properly. Whitney had no trained gunsmiths, no experienced artisans, no workforce capable of building firearms the traditional way. He would have to invent an entirely different approach. The solution came from understanding the cotton gin's fundamental lesson: complex problems become simple when broken into mechanical steps. A musket is complicated, certainly, but it consists of perhaps 50 distinct parts: barrel, lock, stock, trigger, hammer, springs, screws. What if, instead of building complete muskets one at a time, he manufactured each part separately in large quantities, making every example identical? Then any barrel would fit any stock, any lock would fit any barrel, any trigger would fit any lock. Workers could assemble complete muskets from bins of interchangeable parts, requiring minimal skill and achieving enormous speed. It was a beautiful theory. The practical challenges were overwhelming. Making truly interchangeable parts required precision that traditional hand filing could never achieve. Two barrels made by the same craftsman might differ by fractions of an inch in bore diameter, chamber depth, or breech thickness. Those tiny variations meant parts wouldn't interchange. One lock would fit one barrel perfectly but fail to align with another barrel made in the same workshop. Whitney needed machines that could produce parts with absolute consistency. He needed measuring devices that could verify precision to thousandths of an inch. He needed manufacturing systems that eliminated the variability inherent in human craftsmanship. He needed, in short, to invent modern manufacturing. He established a factory in New Haven, Connecticut, purchasing a mill site with water power to drive machinery. He hired laborers, not skilled gunsmiths, but ordinary workers who could operate machines according to instructions. Then he began designing the equipment that would make his vision possible. The milling machine was his first breakthrough. Traditional metalworking relied on filing, manually grinding metal against abrasive surfaces until achieving the desired shape. Filing produced beautiful work, but every piece was unique, dependent on the craftsman's skill and judgment. Whitney's milling machine used rotating cutters that carved metal to precise specifications. Feed a barrel blank into the machine, set the cutting depth, and the machine would produce identical results every time, limited only by the precision of the cutter and the rigidity of the apparatus. He invented specialized jigs that held parts in exact positions during machining. These jigs ensured that every hole was drilled in precisely the same location, every slot was cut to precisely the same depth, every surface was machined to precisely the same contour. The jigs were expensive to build and time-consuming to perfect, but once completed, they allowed unskilled workers to produce parts with a consistency master craftsmen couldn't match by hand. The measuring tools were equally crucial. Whitney designed precision gauges that could verify dimensions to accuracies traditional craftsmen couldn't detect. A go-no-go gauge, for example, had two ends, one size to the maximum acceptable dimension, one size to the minimum. A properly machined part would fit the larger end but not the smaller end. Any part that failed this test was rejected. The gauges eliminated guesswork, eliminated variability, ensured that every part met identical standards. It took longer than promised. The September 1800 deadline passed without a single completed musket. Whitney sent apologetic letters to the War Department, explaining that he was building not just muskets but an entirely new manufacturing system, that the delays were temporary setbacks in service of revolutionary improvements. Government officials grew impatient. Some demanded the contract be cancelled, the advances be repaid. But Secretary Pickering, perhaps recognizing the potential in Whitney's approach, granted extensions. By January 1801, Whitney had completed approximately 500 muskets. The government inspectors arrived expecting to find shoddy workmanship, expecting to confirm their suspicions that Whitney was a charlatan. Instead, they witnessed something that seemed almost magical. Whitney arranged 10 muskets on a table before the inspectors. Then he completely disassembled all 10, mixing the parts together in random piles, all the barrels in one pile, all the locks in another, all the stocks in a third. He asked the inspectors to select any parts they wished and hand them to his workers. The workers, following his instructions, assembled complete muskets from the randomly selected parts. Every barrel fit every stock, every lock fit every barrel, every trigger, every hammer, every screw was interchangeable with its counterparts. The inspectors were stunned. They had never seen anything like this. One inspector wrote in his report that Whitney had discovered the most effective secret for rendering men and machines automatic. Another described the demonstration as proof that art has advanced beyond what was thought possible in mechanics. Word of the demonstration reached President John Adams, who invited Whitney to the Capitol to present his system before the cabinet. In January 1801, Whitney stood in a Washington government building before the President, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, and various military commanders. He repeated his demonstration, disassembling muskets, mixing parts, reassembling them from random selections. The officials watched in silence as perfection emerged from chaos, as workers with no special training created firearms that functioned flawlessly. Thomas Jefferson, soon to be president, was particularly impressed. He understood immediately that Whitney had invented something far more important than a faster way to build muskets. This was a new paradigm for manufacturing everything: clocks, tools, carriages, machinery of all kinds. Jefferson wrote that Whitney's system represented one of the great advances of the age, that it would transform American industry and make the nation self-sufficient in manufacturing. The recognition brought Whitney relief and validation. Here finally was success built on innovation that patents could protect, that government contracts could fund, that didn't depend on Southern planters respecting intellectual property rights. The musket factory was profitable, was growing, was producing firearms that armed the expanding American military. When the War of 1812 erupted, Whitney's manufacturing system proved its value beyond any doubt. The nation needed firearms urgently, needed them in quantities traditional gunsmiths couldn't possibly supply. Whitney's factory, by then producing steadily and efficiently, delivered thousands of muskets that helped defend the nation during its most desperate military crisis since the Revolution. His interchangeable parts system meant that damaged weapons could be repaired quickly in the field by simply swapping broken components for functional ones, a logistical advantage that traditional firearms, with their individually fitted parts, could never match. The profits from government contracts finally lifted Whitney from the poverty that cotton gin piracy had imposed. By 1810, he was wealthy, respected, sought after for advice on manufacturing systems. Other industrialists visited his factory to study his methods, to understand the principles that made such efficiency possible. His machines, his jigs, his gauges, his systematic approach to manufacturing, all of it was being copied, adapted, improved by a generation of manufacturers who recognized they were witnessing the birth of modern industry. Whitney married in 1817, at age 51, finally able to afford a family after decades of poverty and legal warfare. He built a substantial house near his factory, surrounded himself with children and grandchildren, became a pillar of New Haven society. The bitter years of cotton gin battles faded into memory, replaced by the satisfaction of building something lasting and legitimate. But he never forgot the lessons. Innovation without protection is theft waiting to happen. Legal rights without enforcement are worthless. And sometimes the invention you think will make you wealthy proves less valuable than the methods you develop while trying to salvage failure. The cotton gin had changed agriculture but destroyed its inventor. The manufacturing system Whitney created while fleeing that failure would change the entire world. It was perhaps history's most expensive lesson in the unpredictability of innovation's consequences. The numbers tell two stories, and both are true. In 1793, the year Whitney invented the cotton gin, the United States exported 138,000 pounds of cotton. By 1825, the year of Whitney's death, that figure had reached 532 million pounds. American cotton dominated global markets, clothed workers in English textile mills, enriched merchants and shippers, and transformed the young nation from an agricultural backwater into an economic power. The cotton gin had enabled all of it. But there is another set of numbers, darker and more terrible. In 1790, approximately 700,000 people lived in slavery in the United States. Most worked in tobacco, rice, and mixed agriculture. Slavery seemed to be declining economically, becoming less profitable as soil exhausted and labor-intensive crops faced market competition. Many believed the institution would gradually fade. By 1825, the enslaved population had reached 1.4 million. It had doubled. Most of that growth concentrated in cotton-growing states, on plantations that depended on Whitney's invention to make their brutal economy function. Whitney understood this paradox, lived with it, struggled with the knowledge that his mechanical genius had strengthened an institution he despised. In private letters to friends, he expressed anguish about the consequences. He had wanted to help Southern agriculture, to create prosperity, to demonstrate that American innovation could solve ancient problems. He had succeeded beyond measure, and the success had made human bondage more profitable than ever before. Consider the logic that transformed Southern society after 1793. Before the gin, cotton cultivation was limited by the cleaning bottleneck. Growing more cotton meant hiring more workers to clean it by hand, and the wages required made large-scale cultivation unprofitable. After the gin, that bottleneck vanished. Suddenly, any amount of cotton could be cleaned quickly and cheaply. The limiting factor became field labor planting, tending, and harvesting the cotton that machines could now process. Plantation owners responded rationally to these new economics. They purchased more land, planted more cotton, and bought more enslaved workers to cultivate it. The demand for enslaved labor exploded. Traders who had been selling enslaved people south to New Orleans at modest prices suddenly commanded premium rates. The domestic slave trade intensified, with Maryland and Virginia becoming supplier states that bred enslaved people for sale to cotton plantations further south. The violence of this system is difficult to comprehend from safe historical distance. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk in cotton fields, often under brutal overseers who enforced quotas through whipping and other torments. Families were separated as traders sold individuals to different plantations. Children born into slavery inherited that status, creating generations of people whose labor enriched others while they owned nothing, not even their own bodies. And all of it was made economically rational by a machine Whitney had built in 10 months to solve an agricultural problem. The gin didn't create slavery, didn't invent the plantation system, didn't originate the racism that justified treating human beings as property. But it made all of those evils more profitable, more widespread, more resistant to reform. Without the cotton gin, slavery might have declined gradually as tobacco exhausted the soil. With it, slavery became the foundation of Southern prosperity, something wealthy planters would eventually fight a war to preserve. Whitney knew this. He watched cotton cultivation spread across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. He read reports of slave markets in Charleston and New Orleans, of families torn apart, of people worked to exhaustion in fields that fed gins, that cleaned cotton, that enriched everyone except those who had grown it. He understood that his invention bore responsibility for this expansion, that solving one problem had created others far worse. In his later years, he sometimes expressed the wish that he had never invented the cotton gin at all, that he had left the problem unsolved, that short staple cotton had remained economically worthless. But wishing cannot undo history. The gin existed, had been copied thousands of times, had transformed an entire region's economy. The consequences would unfold regardless of the inventor's regrets. Yet, even as the cotton gin's dark legacy was becoming undeniable, Whitney's manufacturing principles were spreading a different kind of revolution across American industry. The interchangeable parts system he had pioneered for muskets was being adapted to clocks, locks, sewing machines, typewriters, bicycles, and eventually automobiles. Every industry that adopted his methods achieved similar results: lower costs, higher production, better quality, and reduced dependence on skilled artisans. The social implications were profound. Traditional manufacturing had relied on craftsmen who spent years learning their trade, who commanded high wages because their skills were irreplaceable. Whitney's system reduced dependence on such expertise. Machines did the precision work. Jigs ensured consistency. Ordinary workers, following instructions, could produce parts that once required master craftsmen. This democratized manufacturing made goods cheaper and more accessible, but it also displaced skilled workers and created new forms of industrial labor that were often dehumanizing in their repetitive monotony. Samuel Colt visited Whitney's factory in the 1820s and adapted the interchangeable parts system to revolver manufacturing. His Hartford factory became famous for producing firearms of unprecedented consistency and reliability. When European gunsmiths examined Colt's revolvers, they marveled at the precision, asked how such accuracy was possible, couldn't believe that ordinary workers using machines had produced what would have required master craftsmen in European workshops. The British sent observers to America specifically to study manufacturing methods. They toured factories, examined machinery, interviewed workers, and wrote detailed reports about what they called the American system of manufactures. What they discovered was that Whitney's principles had spread throughout northern industry, creating a manufacturing revolution that was making the United States competitive with European economies despite having a smaller population and less industrial tradition. Cyrus McCormick applied Whitney's principles to reaper manufacturing. Isaac Singer used them for sewing machines. Manufacturers of clocks, tools, and hardware all adopted the systematic approach: design precise jigs, build specialized machines, produce interchangeable parts, assemble efficiently. By mid-century, American manufacturing was becoming famous worldwide for its efficiency and innovation. The economic implications transformed the nation. Northern states, embracing industrial manufacturing, developed very different economies from the agricultural South. Free labor, mechanization, urbanization, and industrial growth created a society increasingly distinct from the plantation system. These differences would eventually help drive the nation toward civil war, as two incompatible economic systems competed for control of the nation's future. Whitney saw the beginnings of this transformation, but didn't live to see its culmination. He died in January 1825, at age 59, from prostate cancer that caused immense suffering in his final months. He had lived long enough to see the cotton gin transform southern agriculture, to watch slavery expand catastrophically, to witness his manufacturing principles spread across northern industry, and to achieve modest prosperity from government contracts that finally rewarded his innovations. His funeral in New Haven drew hundreds of mourners. Manufacturers praised his genius. Government officials honored his contributions to national defense. Yale celebrated him as perhaps their most accomplished graduate. But the eulogies were complicated. hedged with uncomfortable awareness that Whitney's legacy was profoundly mixed. He had revolutionized both agriculture and manufacturing. One revolution had strengthened slavery. The other was creating the industrial power that would eventually help destroy it. Catherine Greene had died in 1814, 11 years before Whitney. She never saw the Supreme Court finally validate the patent she and Phineas Miller had fought so hard to protect. She never learned whether the cotton gin's legacy would be remembered as liberation or tragedy. But she had witnessed enough to understand that great inventions create consequences their inventors cannot control, that solving one problem often creates others, and that mechanical genius offers no protection against the moral complexities of the real world. The cotton gin's impact on slavery was direct and measurable. By making cotton cultivation enormously profitable, it created economic incentives that entrenched slavery for another 60 years. The enslaved population in cotton states grew from hundreds of thousands to millions. The domestic slave trade intensified into a brutal internal migration that separated families and destroyed communities. Southern political power, based partly on enslaved populations, gave plantation interests control over federal policy for decades. All of this flowed from a machine designed to clean seeds from fiber. But Whitney's manufacturing legacy was equally consequential and far more positive. The principles he pioneered, interchangeable parts, specialized machinery, and systematic production, became the foundation of modern industrial society. Assembly lines, mass production, and standardized components all trace their ancestry to the methods Whitney developed in his New Haven factory. When Henry Ford revolutionized automobile manufacturing with his assembly line in 1913, he was applying principles Whitney had demonstrated more than a century earlier. The tension between these two legacies, one dark, one transformative, defines Whitney's place in history. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more complicated, a genius whose innovations had consequences he couldn't predict and couldn't control. He solved problems brilliantly without understanding that solutions create new problems. He demonstrated that technical excellence doesn't guarantee moral outcomes. He showed that an invention's value can't be judged by its cleverness, but must be measured by its effects on human lives. Perhaps the most important lesson from Whitney's story is that innovation is never neutral. Every invention redistributes power, creates winners and losers, changes incentives in ways that reshape society. The cotton gin made plantation owners wealthy and enslaved people more valuable as property. Whitney's manufacturing system made northern industrialists wealthy and skilled craftsmen less essential. Neither outcome was inevitable, but both flowed from mechanical innovations that seemed, on their surface, to be simply solving practical problems. Whitney understood this better in his final years than he had as a young inventor eager to demonstrate his genius. He wrote to a friend shortly before his death that he had learned to view his inventions with ambivalence, to recognize that brilliance in mechanics offered no wisdom about human consequences. The cotton gin worked perfectly, cleaned cotton exactly as designed, and helped strengthen the most evil institution in American history. The manufacturing system worked perfectly, produced muskets exactly as specified, and helped create the Industrial Revolution that would transform human civilization. Both were his children. Both would outlive him by centuries. And both proved that genius, however impressive, is only one ingredient in progress, and sometimes not even the most important one. Stand in a modern courtroom where a technology company is defending its patent against competitors who claim the innovation is too obvious to deserve protection. Listen to the arguments about what constitutes genuine invention, about whether simple elegance invalidates a claim, about how to balance inventor rights against public access. You are hearing echoes of arguments first made in Whitney's cotton gin trials 2 centuries ago. The legal principles established through Whitney's 13-year battle transformed American patent law in ways that still govern innovation today. Before Whitney's Supreme Court victory, patents were treated inconsistently across states, honored where convenient, and ignored where economically inconvenient. After Chief Justice Marshall's 1807 ruling, patents became federally protected property rights that states must respect regardless of local economic interests. The principle that simple inventions deserve protection equally with complex ones traces directly to Judge Johnson's 1801 decision in Whitney's favor. Johnson had ruled that the cotton gin's elegance, its ability to solve a centuries-old problem with wire hooks and brushes, made it more valuable, not less patentable. This established that patent law protects solutions, not complexity. An invention that seems obvious after demonstration may represent genuine innovation before anyone thinks of it. Modern patent examiners still cite Whitney's case when evaluating applications for elegantly simple inventions. The legal concept of non-obviousness as a patentability requirement evolved partly from debates over whether Whitney's gin was too simple to deserve protection. Today's standards ask, would this solution have been obvious to someone skilled in the field before the inventor demonstrated it? It's a question Whitney's judges wrestled with as they examined wire hooks that seemed, in retrospect, like the natural solution to cotton cleaning. The Whitney case also established important precedents about patent infringement. Judge Johnson's ruling that any mechanism using hooks or saw teeth to pull seeds through a grating while brushes swept fiber away was infringing Whitney's patent, regardless of minor variations, created the legal framework for evaluating equivalence in modern patent disputes. Today, when courts determine whether a new product infringes an existing patent despite superficial differences, they're applying principles first articulated in decisions about cotton gin pirates who claimed their saw teeth were fundamentally different from Whitney's wire hooks. But Whitney's legal legacy extends beyond specific precedents to a broader warning about patent system limitations. His case demonstrated that having legal rights means nothing without enforcement mechanisms. Winning in court means nothing if the damage has already occurred. Perfect patent protection paired with slow justice equals theft, followed by vindication, a pattern that repeats itself in every technological revolution. Consider modern parallels. Software companies watch as competitors copy their innovations and ship products before lawsuits can be resolved. Pharmaceutical companies battle generic manufacturers who begin producing drugs before patent challenges are decided. Hardware startups see their designs stolen by overseas manufacturers who can produce and ship copies faster than courts can issue injunctions. The specifics differ, but the pattern remains. Innovation spreads faster than law can protect it, and inventors often watch others profit from their genius while legal battles drag on. Whitney's manufacturing legacy proved even more consequential than his legal one. The interchangeable part system he pioneered at his musket factory became the foundation for every major manufacturing advance of the next 2 centuries. When Ransom Olds created the first automotive assembly line in 1901, he was scaling up Whitney's principle: make parts to precise specifications, assemble from interchangeable components, minimize skill requirements through systematic processes. Henry Ford famously perfected this approach with his moving assembly line for Model T production. But Ford himself acknowledged that he was applying methods developed a century earlier. His innovation was adding continuous motion, having the product move past workers rather than having workers move to the product. The underlying principles of standardized parts and systematic assembly came directly from Whitney's musket factory. The digital revolution extended these principles into realms Whitney never imagined. Modern electronics manufacturing relies on components made to such precise tolerances that chips produced in different factories on different continents function identically. A smartphone contains parts from dozens of manufacturers worldwide, all designed to exact specifications that enable perfect interchangeability. Whitney would recognize the logic immediately, even if the scale and precision would astound him. Software development adopted manufacturing principles in less obvious but equally profound ways. Modular programming, where complex applications are built from reusable components, mirrors Whitney's approach of building muskets from interchangeable parts. Open-source libraries function like bins of standardized parts that programmers can assemble into complete applications. The systematic processes that enable modern software development, version control, automated testing, continuous integration, all echo Whitney's insight that breaking complexity into manageable, standardized steps enable scale and consistency that artisanal approaches cannot match. Even modern artificial intelligence, built from neural networks that combine standardized components into increasingly sophisticated systems, represents a continuation of principles Whitney pioneered. Define the components precisely, ensure they interact predictably, assemble them systematically, and achieve results that individual craftsmanship could never match. But Whitney's story also warns modern innovators about the eternal tension between invention and theft. Every technological revolution produces the same pattern. A breakthrough innovation appears, pirates copy it immediately, legal battles ensue, and by the time courts resolve the disputes, the technology has spread beyond anyone's control. The internet age has accelerated this cycle dramatically, but the pattern remains unchanged from Whitney's era. Napster and music piracy in the early 2000s mirrored the cotton gin pirates of the 1790s. Technology enabled copying at scale, economic incentives overwhelmed legal restrictions, and by the time courts ruled on rights, millions had already profited from theft. The fact that digital piracy involved electrons rather than cotton seeds changed nothing about the fundamental dynamics. Social media platforms built on content created by users but monetized by corporations echo the planters who profited from Whitney's gin while he struggled in poverty. The creators provide the value, the platform owners collect the revenue, and legal frameworks struggle to keep pace with technological realities. Whitney would understand the economics perfectly, even if the technology would baffle him. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology face similar challenges. Innovations spread globally within hours. Copies and variations proliferate faster than law can define rights. Fortunes are made and lost while regulators debate frameworks. And throughout it all, the innovators often watch others profit from their breakthroughs while they battle in courts or struggle to maintain competitive advantage. The lesson isn't that innovation is futile or that patent protection is worthless. Whitney's manufacturing success demonstrated that some innovations can be protected and monetized, but his cotton gin failure demonstrated that legal rights without enforcement mechanisms provide only moral satisfaction, not financial security. Modern innovators must plan for both scenarios, protecting intellectual property while also ensuring their business model doesn't depend entirely on preventing copying. Whitney's personal trajectory offers guidance here. He pivoted from cotton gins to musket manufacturing, not because he abandoned the gin, but because he recognized that fighting piracy had become his full-time occupation at the expense of new innovation. Modern entrepreneurs face similar choices: invest resources in defending existing products, or redirect energy toward new innovations that might prove more defensible. There's no universal right answer, but Whitney's example suggests that sometimes moving forward matters more than looking backward. His story also reminds us that an invention's most important impacts often differ from what the inventor intended. Whitney wanted to help Southern agriculture and make himself wealthy. He achieved the first goal but failed at the second with the cotton gin. He didn't set out to revolutionize manufacturing that emerged almost accidentally as he sought alternative income after cotton gin profits failed to materialize. Yet his manufacturing legacy proved far more valuable than the cotton gin, both to him personally and to human civilization. This suggests that innovators should remain alert to unexpected applications of their work, to possibilities that emerge during development, to opportunities that weren't part of the original vision. Whitney's precision gauges and milling machines were developed to solve a musket manufacturing problem, but their principles transformed all of manufacturing. Modern innovators who remain flexible about their innovations' applications often discover their most valuable contributions in unexpected places. There's also a warning about unintended consequences. Whitney couldn't have predicted that solving cotton cleaning would strengthen slavery catastrophically. Modern innovators face similar uncertainties. Social media was meant to connect people, but has also enabled misinformation and social fragmentation. Artificial intelligence promises to enhance human capabilities but raises existential questions about employment, privacy, and control. Every powerful technology creates possibilities its inventors didn't anticipate and consequences they can't control. Whitney's later ambivalence about the cotton gin offers wisdom here. He never claimed he should have known better, never pretended moral clarity was possible when facing unprecedented innovations. Instead, he acknowledged that brilliant solutions can produce terrible outcomes, that technical excellence doesn't guarantee beneficial results, and that inventors bear some responsibility for consequences, even when those consequences were unforeseeable. This honest reckoning with mixed legacy feels appropriate for our own era of technological revolution. We're living through changes as profound as anything. Whitney triggered artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, quantum computing, space colonization. These innovations promise immense benefits and pose immense risks. Like Whitney, we're solving problems brilliantly without fully understanding the downstream consequences. His story suggests we should proceed with both confidence and humility. Confidence because innovation has generally improved human welfare despite occasional disasters. Humility because even the most brilliant inventors have limited vision, because solutions create new problems, because moral complexity doesn't yield to technical expertise. Whitney died in 1825, 32 years after inventing the cotton gin, 27 years after securing his first musket contract. He lived long enough to see cotton transform Southern economics, to watch slavery expand catastrophically, to witness his manufacturing principles spread across Northern industry, and to achieve modest prosperity from government work. He never became as wealthy as the cotton gin should have made him, but he died respected, accomplished, and aware that his contributions would outlast his personal disappointments. 2 centuries later, his legacy surrounds us. Every assembled product embodies principles he pioneered. Every patent dispute invokes precedents his battles established. Every innovator facing piracy confronts dilemmas he experienced. And every technological revolution that produces unintended consequences echoes the mixed results of his genius. The cotton gin changed the world. The interchangeable parts system changed it more. And the story of how one man experienced both triumphs and tragedies through mechanical innovation offers lessons that remain profoundly relevant as we navigate our own era of revolutionary change. Stand in a modern factory where robots assemble smartphones from components manufactured across 3 continents. Watch as precision machining produces parts to tolerances measured in microns. Observe as quality, the control systems verify that every component meets exact specifications. You are witnessing the fulfillment of a vision that began in a New Haven workshop 200 years ago, when a desperate inventor fleeing cotton gin piracy created the methods that would enable modern manufacturing. Whitney's genius solved problems. His perseverance established rights. His flexibility enabled survival. And his honest reckoning with mixed consequences offers wisdom for every generation that follows. Building on innovations we can barely control, creating futures we cannot fully predict, and hoping that brilliance, combined with humility, might bend progress toward justice, even when genius alone proves insufficient.